This video is brought to you by True Tales of Buried Treasure, the largest collection of old treasure magazines in the West. On our website, you can search for individual treasure stories by region, or buy our original magazines themselves. To pay us a visit, please click on the link in the description. Enjoy. The tale of Elmer Naston and the pothole gold of the Snake River Canyon is a captivating mix of history and legend. In 1887, Naston embarked on a journey to recover a portion of gold that had been accidentally discovered by beaver trappers nearly half a century earlier. The original discovery, made before 1840, came during the last days of the Mountain Men, those rugged trappers who scoured the American West for beaver pelts. The trappers John Schumann, Obadiah Ironman, and Frederick Monahan had stumbled upon the gold while fleeing from hostile Native Americans. Forced into the Grand Canyon of the Snake River, the men found themselves trapped between the canyon's towering walls and the swift, treacherous waters of the Snake River. Their journey was fraught with danger, but it was during a stop to gather water that they made a discovery that, at the time, seemed only a curious oddity. In a series of rock potholes along the riverbank, the trappers found yellow pebbles that they later realized were gold nuggets. However, in the late 1830s, before the California gold rush had sparked a nationwide frenzy, the value of their find wasn't immediately clear to them. They collected the nuggets as souvenirs and continued their trapping expedition. It wasn't until they returned to St. Louis with their haul of beaver pelts that they learned the true worth of the yellow pebbles. Decades later, Elmer Naston retraced the steps of these trappers, driven by stories of the untapped gold. His tenacity paid off when he managed to recover $15,000 worth of gold from a single pothole despite breaking his leg in the process. The gold that remains is believed to be buried under rock and gravel, a hidden treasure waiting to be uncovered by those daring enough to follow in Naston's footsteps. The story is rich with the rugged spirit of the American frontier, blending the allure of gold with the harsh realities of life in the wild. While the fate of the remaining gold is uncertain, the legend of Naston and the Snake River Canyon continues to capture the imagination of treasure hunters and history enthusiasts alike. The gold nuggets discovered by the trappers in 1840 were of little value to them at the time, as they had no real way to trade or sell them. A few people bought the nuggets out of curiosity, but the general lack of knowledge about gold's true worth is hard to comprehend today. Though gold had been discovered and mined in the deep Southwest years before, with a padre in Southern California obtaining some from an Indian as early as 1832, there was no excitement in the United States over the potential riches hidden in the vast Rocky Mountains. For the trappers, their fortunes were tied to furs, which were rapidly becoming scarce. They didn't view gold as particularly valuable. Even the renowned Kit Carson, who found gold while on a trapping expedition, thought little of his discovery. When the three trappers brought their gold back in 1840, it created no stir, and their discovery was largely forgotten for many years. One of the trappers, John Schumann, sent 3 of the nuggets to his 16-year-old sister in Illinois, who later became Isabel Trial. He detailed the location of the potholes where the gold had been found. These nuggets were eventually appraised at $20 each. In his letter, Schumann described the canyon and the surrounding country, noting that the potholes were large, rounded, and half filled with the curious yellow pebbles. He speculated that if gold ever became valuable, a fortune could be found in that canyon. However, what became of Schumann himself remains unknown. In 1870, Isabel Trial's son, Robert Trial, returned home from college for the Christmas holidays, bringing his roommate, Norman Estelle, with him. Mrs. Trial shared with them the story of her older brother John, the family's adventurer, and showed them the letter and nuggets he had sent her years earlier. By then, gold rushes in the West were old news, but the young men were eager to explore the Snake River Canyon in search of the potholes. In July 1871, they made their way to the Snake River and, without much difficulty, found the potholes containing gold nuggets. Their adventure, as Robert later recounted, was rather uneventful. The two collected about 40 pounds of gold by simply picking out the largest pieces. Neither of them knew anything about panning for fine gold, despite having brought the necessary equipment. Their work was abruptly interrupted one afternoon when two prospectors rushed down the canyon, warning of an outbreak of Bannock and Shoshone raids in Idaho and Wyoming. Trial and Estelle quickly packed up and joined the prospectors, who helped them navigate the treacherous terrain. The four eventually made it to Salt Lake City, where the young men sold their livestock and took a stagecoach and train back home. The gold they had recovered was enough for both to start their own businesses. Trial opened a general merchandise store. Unfortunately, the lean business years of 1877 and 1878 bankrupted Trial, who was now married with 2 children. Believing he could easily return to the potholes and recover enough gold to rebuild his life, he borrowed money from his mother and headed west once more. However, the canyon's obstacles seemed even more formidable this time. After 3 weeks of arduous travel, he finally reached the area where he believed the potholes were located. But despite days of searching and examining countless natural potholes in the solid rock, he found nothing, not even a speck of gold. Discouraged and out of supplies, Trial returned to his home in Illinois, empty-handed. 5 years later, Elmer Naston, a cousin of the elder Mrs. Trial, returned to Illinois after spending 15 years in the far west. By then, Robert Trial had successfully re-established his store and was doing well. Naston soon learned about the story of the pothole gold in the Snake River Canyon, Robert's initial success in finding it, and his puzzling failure to relocate it. This tale sparked Naston's curiosity, and by 1887, he found himself in Lander, Wyoming. There, seasoned frontiersmen recounted the story of 3 trappers who had discovered pothole gold on the Snake River before 1840, an account strikingly similar to the one Schumann had detailed in his letter to Mrs. Trial nearly 50 years earlier. Armed with all the information he could gather from both Mrs. Trial in Illinois and the old-timers in Wyoming, Naston outfitted himself with a riding horse and 2 sturdy mules and set off for the Snake River. His journey took him through the Rocky Mountains and the Wind River Ranges, and then over the Gros Ventre country to the canyon. Once there, Naston encountered all the obstructions he had been warned about. Like Robert Trial before him, he was forced to exit the canyon multiple times, detour, and re-enter the Snake River Gorge. Naston suspected that Trial's failure might have been due to erosion, possibly a frost-induced rock slide that had concealed the potholes. When Naston reached the area where he believed the potholes to be, he kept a close watch for any signs of natural events that might have covered them. In one spot, he discovered that the southeast rim of the canyon had sheared off, burying what could have been a solid bench under thousands of tons of rock. Though he considered the arduous task of removing the debris to test the original bench, he ultimately decided against it. Naston continued downstream for 10 more days, panning as he went, but found no trace of gold. Convinced that he had left the pothole region, he reluctantly returned to the site of the massive rock slide and set up camp. After carefully studying the chaotic mass of debris, he chose a spot where the rock cover was thinnest and began clearing it away by hand. After digging down about 20 feet, he uncovered what appeared to be an extensive rock bench, which encouraged him to continue working. However, the task of removing the heavy stones to a suitable piling place became overwhelming. After a week of back-breaking labor, Naston was on the verge of giving up. He was now dealing with massive rocks, some weighing tons, which he had to gopher around. Deciding to give it one more day, Naston hadn't worked an hour before he found the first rounded pothole. It was dry and filled with broken stones, but beneath them, the pit, about 4 feet in diameter, contained gravel. As he cleared away the debris, he spotted large gold nuggets in the pothole. Naston carefully picked out several nuggets with his fingers, but realized that he would need to carry the gravel to the river's edge to pan it properly. Using a heavy canvas sack from his supplies, he made 3 trips to the river, where he panned the gravel and recovered nearly as much fine gold as he had from the large nuggets. The one pothole yielded a total of $15,000 worth of raw gold, an astonishing amount, especially considering the hole's shallow depth. That night, Naston lay awake, wondering where the gold in the potholes had originated. He speculated that, over eons, it had been washed in from a source that, if discovered, might lead to a mother lode containing unimaginable riches. The next day he removed more rock, uncovering another pothole, though this one produced less than $5,000 worth of gold. Despite 2 more days of hard labor, he failed to find another pothole in the area, so he began examining the old avalanche, which spanned about 400 feet in length and 50 feet in width. Realizing that he had started in the least promising spot, Naston moved upstream about 100 feet. After removing another layer of stones, he found a small pothole just 10 paces away. From this hole, he extracted about $2,000 worth of gold. At this point, the solid rock bench seemed to curve, causing the stones above it to pile up even higher. Determined, Naston attacked the mass, moving rocks to one side of his hand-dug trench until the pile became almost too tall to manage. For 5 long days he toiled, carrying stones to the lower side of the trench, until he finally uncovered another pothole. This pothole held even more gold than the last, with larger nuggets and coarse gold deposits. From this deeper pothole, Naston recovered an estimated $20,000 worth of gold. Once he had cleaned it out, he faced a tough decision: either move stones from a depth of 30 feet or attempt to dig another open-top tunnel into the avalanche. He chose the latter, intending to dig another 8 or 10 feet. However, this decision nearly cost him his life. After working for little more than an hour on the new trench, the walls on either side began to collapse. Naston heard the rocks sliding toward him and tried to escape, but he wasn't fast enough. When the slide ended, he found himself pinned under massive rocks, racked with pain. He drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the afternoon, eventually realizing that he couldn't rely on anyone else for help. He would have to save himself or perish where he lay. With painstaking effort, Naston began removing the smaller stones, but the enormous rock trapping his left leg was immovable. He started the slow process of wedging small, flat rocks under one edge of the boulder, gradually lifting it until he could drag his leg free. To his dismay, he discovered that his leg was broken above the ankle. His body was badly bruised, and his head was covered in lacerations and swollen knots. He was weak from pain and shock. Crawling downstream, he found a few pieces of dead wood, which he used to splint his broken leg temporarily. Knowing he needed better splints before the swelling worsened, he dragged himself back to camp, retrieved his axe, and hacked down a cedar tree. He split a sturdy branch into appropriate slices and cut his denim jacket into strips to bind the splints. Thankfully, the bone had not pierced the skin. For the next 5 days, Naston endured severe pain. Uncertain if he would survive, his greatest fear was gangrene. Fortunately, the dry, clean air helped prevent complications, and soon he was able to move around slowly, using a makeshift crutch fashioned from a forked limb. Realizing he needed to leave the canyon as soon as he could travel, Naston, in the meantime, hobbled back to the rock pile and, incredibly, began another trench. Progress was slow, but before he had dug 4 feet into the pile, he uncovered another pothole. Though not as lucrative as his previous finds, this latest deposit yielded about $3,000 in nuggets and fine gold. Eventually, Naston removed the splints from his leg and found he could walk on it with the aid of his crutch. But, likely overestimating his recovery, he fell and re-injured the leg. Though the new injury was minor, it forced him to stay in camp, unable to travel. By then, Naston estimated that he had recovered about $45,000 in raw gold, later selling it for $49,160, and was ready to leave the Snake River Canyon for good. As he made his way out of the canyon, following the river's course into Idaho, Naston encountered little difficulty. He camped for a night on flatland near the river, on a site that today lies in the middle of Palisades Reservoir. The next morning, unable to resist the urge to prospect, he panned the riverside and found traces of gold. Over the next 3 days, he recovered about $1,000 in gold flakes, which had been deposited quickly from an upstream source. Satisfied that he had cleaned out the deposit, he continued on his journey. Naston eventually reached Idaho Falls, where he sold his gold and equipment. He then drifted to Indianapolis, Indiana, where he briefly engaged in an unrecorded business venture. Despite the wealth he had found, Elmer Naston was never tempted to return to the beautiful and rich Snake River Canyon. He later moved to southern Utah, where he purchased a small cattle ranch near Kanab. There, the old prospector lived out his days contentedly until his death in 1940. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to read the original article or purchase the magazine from which it was taken, please check out our website, truetalesofburiedtreasure.com.